Namaste,
Namaste.
and welcome to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. The first part of this will be discussion on virus.
We started last time on the theme of viruses and bacteria. And of course, we dwelt much more on bacteria. With the concept what she has introduced here, which is so important, so radical, the good bacteria. That to get cured for any illness, there is a good bacteria which will cure that illness, which is more contagious than the bad bacteria. And so we come back to that thing we started with last time. 90% of all bacteria are good bacteria. Only 10% are so-called bad. And so in our own environment, if we fill ourselves with goodwill, good, positive, optimistic energy, we are generating good bacteria or repelling bad bacteria, and you will find you are automatically immune. But this must seep in all the way to your most physical part. It's not enough that in my mind I think, oh, all positive, all good, but my body says, yes, but this is not nice, that fellow is not good, it doesn't feel nice here. That's a very different vibration. That's where the illnesses come really. You must seep it into the physical consciousness. So with this background, where we have primarily focused on bacteria, I have so far not spoken of viruses. And there's a very big difference we must understand between viruses and bacteria. You see, again, in the common description, we almost use these words interchangeably. I have a viral infection, I have a bacterial infection. What's the difference? Oh, it's just we use different medicines. That's all we know, right? We can even say bacterial infection you kill with antibiotic, but viral infection you cannot. Even if you take antibiotic, it will do nothing. You need an antiviral, and that's only given in very rare circumstances, and it doesn't act on all viruses either. And you have a very different story with the virus. So first, let's understand the difference. Bacteria are complete self-contained units that live by themselves. They have a genetic core, and then they have a whole machinery to manufacture, to spread, to grow in the genetic code, and to split, to make two. So they give birth. Bacteria are giving birth all the time. Every 20 minutes, a bacterium will split to form two. So if you have a petri dish with one single bacterium, 20 minutes later you have 2, 20 minutes later you have 4, 20 minutes later you have 8, 16, 32. And if you have 1 million, 20 minutes later you have 2 million, and 20 minutes later you have 4 million. You can see how the scaling up takes place rapidly. And in the body, if it's a bad bacteria that invades, of course, if it's good, you're good. If it's a bad bacteria that invades, at that point, they will infect a part, let's say your throat, your chest, your stomach, your lower part of the digestive process or upper part. They are very specific targetings. Virus is fundamentally different. Virus does not target a location, it ends up affecting the whole body. But why? Why is it different? First of all, a virus is not self-contained unit. It does not exist by itself or cannot replicate by itself. In fact, the behavior of virus is such, science is not even sure whether to call it living. Bacteria definitely is a living cell. Virus is not living. It's on the borderline between life and death. So virus, when it goes to sleep, becomes a crystal. You will not see in it any sign of life. You can take it through space, put it in the extremes of radiation of certain types, it will not die. And then you bring it back into an environment which is humid and comfortable, and suddenly this crystalline structure unfolds itself and becomes now an active virus. Now you remember what we just read of what the mother says about the will, force, vibrational quality of energy. And in the virus you see this even more distinctly than in the bacteria. Bacteria at least is formed and is a material, sustainable, growing structure. A virus does not have any of these. So what does it do? This will does not have a body, does not have an organized mechanism to spread. It must infect another body and hijack its mechanism to replicate itself. So the virus enters a bacterium, or a human cell. The virus enters into it, seizes the machinery, hijacks it totally, inserts its DNA and starts replicating its DNA until it grows so much, replicates copies of its little packets of vibratory energy, until the cell cannot contain it anymore and it bursts and all the virus are released. Very different process from bacteria's multiplication. Or occasionally it inserts itself inside and does not replicate too fast but continues to manufacture bit by bit little pieces while it stays as if in not latent, but still it's still doing its thing. It's hidden as if, and it's like when you have a startup which is in secret mode. There's a word for they use the stealth mode. That's the word. So it stays in stealth mode. Okay, so it's there. It's doing its thing, but it's not obviously revealing itself until it builds up sufficiently, and after a while you find the disruptions beginning. That's one mode. The other mode is it just keeps growing and the cell bursts. And now you have 1 million viruses going out, hijacking other cells. Suddenly, it gets in, the ill will, now let's talk from an occult point of view, the ill will bundle vibration gets in, hijacks goodwill healthy bundle, warps it, twists it, amplifies itself and then bursts out and spreads now with more force and more pieces. And that's how the virus spreads. But the virus has no capacity of its own to replicate or survive. And this tells you something very important. Even in size, the virus is typically almost 200 times smaller than a bacterium. So bacteria you can see in a microscope. Virus you cannot see in a normal microscope, optical microscope. You have to see only in an electron microscope. It's so tiny. And at that point in electron microscopes, you cannot see living things. So we cannot see virus in action. But we see its structure when it is semi-dead. It's never truly dead. It's dormant. And what do you see? Interestingly, it has almost geometric shapes. Because it's a crystal at that point. So there are two kinds of viruses. Either they are spiral, helical we'll say, and then cubical. And some variations of the geometric, it's almost like a cube with sharp flat edges. But it may not be a cube perfectly, it can be one of those with 5, 6, 8, 10, whatever number of sides. But they're called cubical viruses, and these are helical, where it forms like a helical and long cylindrical structure. And then there's a virus which is a complex of these two. The two joint, so there's a helical part and then a cubical head, and that's the virus. And then it goes and attaches, inserts, and makes copies of itself. Unlike a bacterium, which is like a fully formed cell, sometimes with a tail with which it propels itself, nice DNA structure, stable life form, ability to replicate by division. The virus may have a single strand of DNA or a double strand of DNA or some portions which then it inserts, and the mechanism of hijack is not understood. How is it this is able to get in? How does it have the knowledge of how to take over the machinery of the bacteria and manufacture itself? There is not enough intelligence content to be able to manage that. And at that point, you see, science fails here. But the occult understanding we see clearly. It's the ill will which gets in and seizes the will of the cell, hijacks it, possesses it. Again, the same word, possession. We used that last time. We discussed about possession in the context of parasites. Well, something like this. A possession takes place of the will of the cell by this ill will, which now starts replicating and expanding. So the occult perspective explains, obviously, it doesn't need intelligence for that. It's a seizing of energy, seizing energy. Again, without exception, there is no virus which is good. Unlike bacteria, which is 90% good for us, and even the ones which are bad, really, they are nature's cleaners. They scavenge, and that's why they are bad. They are too violent, too excessive, too overdoing in their action. But among viruses, you don't find anything good. And so, Mother's description of how the which we read last time, the lower vital forces of ill will clashing against each other and breaking down and acquiring a physical characteristic applies much more directly to viruses than to bacteria. But, and that's where you see only ill will, only harm. They seem to serve no purpose at all in evolution other than, well, helping eliminate the weak in a species so that the strong may grow as a negative. In the scheme of things, that's the purpose that the asuric forces serve. So in the viral structure itself, you see that operation which matches most closely to ill will and asuric energies or tendencies. Now, having understood this, we look at what human beings are doing with viruses. And then what we see is not so nice, and it's a bit disturbing. There is a lot of attempt to weaponize this knowledge that we have relatively recently got, both of bacteria and of viruses. Since bacteria can be relatively easily killed, it's not so interesting to weaponize. Viruses being much more aggressive, much more destructive, and can be in stealth mode, rapidly grow in a single cell and burst out into 1 million in one go, they are more useful to weaponize. So there has been concerted programs in the militaries of different parts of the world in the guise of studying viruses to find cures for illnesses. They actually develop more and more complex and dangerous variants of the viruses. And right now we are seeing a huge crisis in China and the rest of the world in what is called the novel coronavirus of 2019. Why novel? Because it's new. What is coronavirus? It's the virus of the common cold. There is another variant of it which is called the SARS virus, and there are a few other, Ebola virus and a few others. Each has its own peculiarities. The common feature on all of them is there's no cure. They're just vicious. They get into you, they hook you, they multiply, they cause you harm with the common cold. You can do nothing. You just wait it out. Take rest until that energy is expelled from your system. And you will notice at the time where the illness turns, suddenly within you an optimism surges. And from that point, you know, now it's going to end, and within 2 or 3 days it's gone. In the same way, when it first gets into you, it's like something troubling you, weakening you, sapping your energy, and you're pushing, and at some point you say, I can't push anymore, I let go, and boom, the illness gets in, and you have caught the viral fever. The fever hits you just like that. Suddenly, temperature shoots up. So you realize primarily the battle is at the level of energies, of which the viral and biological interaction is a representation. But what happens in these weaponization labs? You take these viruses and you try to tweak them and make out of them something. Observe, you infect animals, see how rapidly they grow, what kind of illnesses they produce, try to target them to match certain genetics. For example, in one of the countries in the Middle East, I don't name them now, one of the countries I'd seen in around 98, there was a news item that said that country was trying to develop a virus which would be genetically targeted to the genotype of the opposite racial who were against them or who they were against. And you can tailor viruses because the viruses have this one ability, which is all their ability is. Whatever their DNA content, they go and insert it into another cell and multiply. What is their DNA content? You don't care. It can be a single strand. It's not enough to sustain life. But a single strand is enough and the virus will do its job. So the first thing they found, the most useful application of this was to use viruses as a delivery mechanism to insert DNA inside good cells. So all your genetic modification of cells, of grain, of any life forms is done through insertion through a virus. So when they say, for example, we have created a genetically modified breed of vegetable or rice or animal, the question you could ask is, how did they snip out that particular gene and insert it into a healthy cell? Or how did they remove from the healthy cell a piece of gene? Well, the mechanism was the virus. Virus is your delivery tool. So in the process, the virus has inserted your genetic content, but also its own genetic content. And that's the reason why the genetically modified food is sensed by your body to be something weird, something sick, and the body creates a reaction to it. So all those who have, for example, reactions to peanut allergy and various other allergies, which are all new. Now even wheat allergy is a big deal. And it all started in the US. You never heard of peanut allergy before the US. And now it started in India. Because the same breed of peanut is being grown in India. And those breeds were genetically modified with insertion of virus gene and other gene. When it gets into your body, the body is picking up the energetic content of the virus gene, the ill will which is in the virus. And it reacts to that. I don't want this, and inflames itself to block. And that's your reaction of allergy.
Can recombinant DNA be positive?
I am sure one can insert positive genetic strands equally in this way, but the vehicle of insertion will bring its own particular twist or content. And I'm not sure if we have the ability to prevent that insertion. There are other means now of intervening in genes without using virus as a delivery mechanism, and there's something called Cas-CRISPR which is able to do certain things. But again, to the extent that we are reliant on viruses, there is no way to prevent this particular quality of ill will which is inherent in the virus bundle itself. You cannot prevent its insertion into the cells.
Was the coronavirus...
So now we come to the military application.
Exactly.
The military application of the viruses. And well, I wanted you to understand why we have this problem with viruses and the genetic modifications. You could equally have changed the genetics by other means, which include a psychological intervention, which was the way of the good old days, where you grew many plants, you picked the ones which had the quality, and then you put an intention when planting the seed, and that quality was amplified when the plant grew. So you could take a plant, for example, which is not common to, let's say, Pondicherry climate. You take a cold climate plant, you plant the seed with the intention that it should adapt to this temperature. It grows with slight change. You take its seed and again plant with that intention, and within 2 or 3 generations you will have a plant adapted. And you have done that already? How many generations did it take?
A couple.
Okay, a couple.
But Mother did tell Parichand, when roses could not be grown in Pondicherry, that he had to keep working at it, keep doing it, keep planting new ones, until it was in their consciousness to survive here.
Yes. And so what you're doing is you're infusing the human goodwill and good intention into the plant consciousness, and from seed level, you're helping it to grow with that. So it's equivalent to the gene splicing which you would have done, because you're doing it, finally it's an energy bundle that's meeting energy bundle, but without the virus ill will, which is inherent to current genetic interventions, and it's always ill will. Virus, as I said, there's no good virus. Its only job is get in and replicate itself. It's a kind of a desire, ill will impulse. Even if you reduce ill will, it's just persistent desire to get into someone else and push itself in. That's the energy quality to whatever variant of virus you have. And that's used as an insertion. You see how if you think of it occultly, what did the scientist do? He took a genetic quality, let's say a vibration of energy, took this power of insertion of self-aggrandizement, linked it here, and then said, like an arrow, sent it shooting to do its work. Energetically, you see the whole thing, and it's a very different picture. And you understand the results of it. Now, when this was weaponized, it has been weaponized, many viruses have been created. Of course, inevitably, sometimes they leak out. And then you have uncontained kinds of sicknesses that spread overnight. And interestingly, many of these have been correlated with military experiments. Ebola virus, for example, in Africa was spread in a place where there is a special viral lab. It started from there. Of course, they cover it up saying it came from some monkey or some bat or whatever story they make up. But It was always associated with some location. And the current coronavirus, which started in the city of Wuhan in China, that city, or right next to that city, has China's most advanced antiviral, most advanced military viral lab. And the particular sample of coronavirus it had got from Canada. And this was a level 4 lab where they can experiment with this grade of viruses, and they were upgrading to level 5 where they can experiment with even more dangerous viruses such as Ebola and others, for which there is no ability to contain or cure. And just around there, this virus has escaped. So you can say it came from, they can say it came from some animals, but the evidence points to some escape from the military facility. And the evidence is very simple. In the coronavirus, they found there are 4 segments which do not belong to coronavirus but belong to the SARS virus. Sorry, not the AIDS virus, HIV virus, not the SARS.
HIV.
So HIV virus is so different from the coronavirus, and yet a snippet of gene transferring, you could still say, okay, random mutation. Of course, that doesn't explain anything. But if you find 4 separate chunks, you can't say it's random. It was intentional. And interestingly, we discovered the scientists from that Wuhan lab had published a paper about 10 years ago where they described experiments precisely like this, that they were taking AIDS virus components and inserting into the coronavirus. They were doing that 10 years ago. And suddenly now we have just around that space this particular coronavirus with the AIDS content in it, spreading wildly, viciously, rapidly. Numbers which the government are putting out are, according to many serious estimates and the evidence of numbers of people actually being cremated, the numbers officially released are 1/10 of the actual numbers. So there's a huge suppression involved. But why am I pointing this out here? Why is this important? Because from an occult point of view, what were the scientists doing? They took one pattern of bundle of ill will, they took another pattern of bundle of ill will and transferred characteristics of this ill will into that to produce a more sophisticated and complex ill will. What were they doing in their intention was to produce ill will, right? Why is a military scientist experimenting with dangerous viruses to produce more dangerous versions out of ill will? Even if the personal scientist is not doing with ill will, the people who have authorized him are doing it with ill will. And so what you see, I'm trying to show the occult view. Ill will combining using materialized bundles of ill will to produce more materialized bundles of ill will. What happens is, when it escapes, it spreads. And at that point there is no antidote, or at least no known currently. And you see what's happening in the powers that be. They say, well, wait another year and we'll produce a vaccine. And here the story gets weird. In Africa, when the Ebola virus was growing, it had been on for 2 or 3 years, it had been reasonably contained in that area. And there was one scientist who was an American virologist who was right there in the midst of it, studying how it spreads. And then they announced that he had caught the Ebola virus. Till then there was no known cure. They were busy building a vaccine. The day he got infected, suddenly the companies announced, oh yeah, we have, by the way, an experimental Ebola cure, but it's still experimental and we're going to try it out on him. And he's given the experimental Ebola cure the very next day, and he's flown to the United States, driven through the middle of Los Angeles city to go to a hospital facility where he is convalescing and gets well. Now, nobody would do that if they had no known cure. It's almost as if the cure was always there. They don't put it out into the wild to test unless they have a cure to back. But they did not want the cure to be public. When their own person got infected, he would have spilled the beans if they let him die. He would have told everybody, look, we have the cure. So they had to protect him. And then comes immediately after the then President of the United States, Obama, comes out with a public statement, we should not give importance to these experimental cures, we should wait for the vaccine to come out. Because if you bring out your so-called experimental cure, let's say you have 1,000 infected people, they will all be cured. But when you bring out a vaccine, you're going to vaccinate millions of people who are afraid of being infected, isn't it? So you feed on the fear to produce a vaccine which you will sell on a larger mass. And this is where you see the whole game is built around this fear, hatred, perversion of energies operating from more complex mental formations to vital formations to physical formations of the illness. And there's a whole ecosystem of this perversion. It is entirely asuric. Now in this you may not distinguish and say this fellow is an asura. It doesn't work like that. The energy of that whole operation is asuric. And it materializes in that particular form of the modified virus which is put out to infect or accidentally released, as it appears to be sometimes, and spreads in this way. So from an occult point of view, from a spiritual point of view, it is equally possible to reverse this spread by infusing from above a contrary vibration and neutralizing this hatred, illness, ill will vibration. And this is generally what happens. So again, this goes into an area which people may not recognize the value of. When there is a strong infection that has spread, what happened in Japan that the mother narrates, she fought against this force when it came to her. It was sucking her energy. She was growing weaker and weaker. But she had the occult power to push back and neutralize and dissolve that formation. She got cured, but immediately the whole plague ended. Within a day or two, everybody was cured. How does that happen? It cannot happen if it's just a physical, biological process. It happened because the occult force behind it was defeated. Now, it is a fact that whenever there have been such dangerous plagues in the world, there have been interventions from spiritual forces equally to neutralize and contain or completely dissolve that formation. Of course, other formations may grow, etc. It's the reason why life has survived on Earth. Because even as here, you may say random or occult forces are working, there are higher spiritual forces working to neutralize. Goodwill is always greater than ill will and always more powerful than ill will, because the force of harmony is more powerful than the force of division and conflict. And so inevitably those things get defeated, but the key to the defeat is top down through the spiritual and occult intervention, which is happening all the time. We may not know it, that's all. But when human beings participate in building the ill will, then it's as if at a material level there's a formation which is too hard. And the spiritual intervention and the occult intervention has to now act against this occult intervention which has been built up by the humans. And so it takes much longer. So occasionally when in nature you have these plagues that come up, or any kind of such sudden spread of illnesses, there's an intervention, it stops. But when humans have built, they've also built a formation. They have a vehicle now which is sustaining this. And an intervention from above has to fight this formation and vehicle. It's like a rigid carapace or covering that it has to cut through to be able to defeat this force. That's the struggle currently with the coronavirus. And it's one of the reasons why it seems to take much longer and its spread is also more vicious, because there's a human support for it.
Are these laboratories all over the world?
It is shocking if you think about it. China has 4 of these laboratories, United States has 5, France has 1, Canada has 1, UK has, Germany has, I don't know how many.
Why?
You would ask yourself why? If the goal was to find cures for viral diseases, then 1 is enough for the whole world. Because you don't have more than 1 or 2 serious viral illnesses. 1 lab would be enough. But you have so many in each of these countries precisely because the goal is weaponization. And that's unfortunately the ill will in humanity, or rather the asuric force now organized in human consciousness, which prevents the divine help from being able to neutralize the thing at its source. And that's why there is this problem. That's why there is so much suffering. And we, as if are caught in between in this game. And so from a spiritual perspective, within us, all this discussion was to make us conscious that the physical, biological form of bacteria, virus, or even our physical cells is a condensation in matter of life energy forms which have behind them perhaps even some higher mental intentions or wills, and they are condensed to a physical level. If in our consciousness we are able to grow in positivity, goodwill, and positive will for resilience and good health, and if this intention or this quality of energy vibration can condense down to our most physical level, we can not only become reasonably, let's say, immune to these illnesses, but the goodwill we spread can also reduce and eventually neutralize the forms of ill will that these viruses or bacteria represent. And so you see, in its ultimate sense, it's a battle between the divine forces of evolution and the asuric forces. It operates on so many levels, but this is that grade of the vital physical domain of cellular and even viral structures, which is really a focal point for that battle finally. We have a few minutes in case any of you here have questions, we could address them.
Isn't the spiritual force will help to...
Spiritual force will work naturally. You see, it's like children playing, they end up doing some harm, the parents rush to clean up the mess or to prevent them from harming themselves, but only as much as they allow you to intervene. But if they push you away, what can you do? And that's the problem of the spiritual help. Where these diseases were natural, as has happened at various times, various plagues and other things, of course the help came also. But you have to recognize the help is also battling the opposite force. And sometimes it has a physical basis in humanity.
Now with the advent of the supramental force, how much greater is the help?
Well, the help is greater for sure, but the resistance also has grown greater, which was part of the problem that the Mother and Sri Aurobindo had to face, that increasingly as they brought down the supramental force into the earth consciousness, the resistance against it also hardened and pushed back. That's the reason why Sri Aurobindo had to leave his body, because we had this discussion another time.
Yes.
But finally, all rests on our willingness and the choice we make for what is more important and what is it that we refuse to engage with.
But in these military labs, they created these viruses to put those viruses in other countries
Yes.
and destroy other countries.
Yes. So this particular virus, created as it seems to be in a military lab, has very specific targeting. It seems to target much more an Asian type genetics. It seems to target middle-aged to older people. It seems to be very vulnerable to high humidity and high temperatures. So it does not work in tropical climates. It's like fine-tuned for cooler and drier climates.
And children seem to be not affected
Relatively
by it.
immune. Children are relatively immune.
Yes.
It targets as if the older population, and it seems to target men more than women. Something like that I recall seeing. I've made a list of all the characteristics. I don't know if I can dig it out. But this kind of targeting,
It's turning against them. That means
well, it seems to have escaped.
whatever the weapons you make
Yes.
for destroying others, they can destroy you.
Yes. That's like that. Anybody else has any questions? Yes.
Yeah, is it possible to check ourselves if we have any ill will hidden, or not the hidden ill wills? Hidden ill wills in us.
Yes.
How to find out and
You know, rather than fighting the hidden ill will within you, you grow in goodwill within you. It's like the battle between good bacteria and bad bacteria. Rather than removing the bad ones, you grow the good ones, the bad ones have no place.
Yes.
So you spread within you the
Yes.
purifying Cow dung water,
Yeah.
sattvic quality, the milk of the cow, the sattvic quality is spread.
Is there any way to make sure that we are doing the good, all the good things, all good?
You know, you cannot make sure. What you do is, in everything you do, you try to bring more and more goodwill and positivity. And things will pop up. Situations will reveal to you a situation where suddenly you find a negative reaction coming and you say, where did this come from? And you change it. So every time something pops up, you're being helped to expose and change yourself. That's all.
Love is still the greatest healing force.
Yes. So I made this list interestingly. The new coronavirus infects middle-aged men significantly more than women and children. It infects Asians more easily than other ethnic groups, remains in stealth mode, spreading without symptoms for 15 to 24 days, more than any other virus known to us, far longer than any other, causes anaphylactic shock and rapid death in those vaccinated for SARS, very interestingly. Those who have had a vaccine for SARS, when they get the coronavirus, there's a shock in the system and suddenly they're walking and they just collapse. It's a sudden thing. They suffocate and collapse. And mutates too fast to target with simple vaccines and sounds, okay, I said sounds like a highly focused and targeted weapon. And then I found one more thing. The virus thrives in cold and dry climates, does not survive beyond 30 degrees and 80% humidity. And so it seems as if in the natural cycle of the seasons, as the summer season comes, it will tend to die out. But the protection for us, very simply, is expose yourself to the sun. Breathe fresh air. Do not stay in closed, air-conditioned climate. If you expose yourself to the sun, what is sun energetically? Spiritual light. Isn't it?
Yes.
The sun represents the supramental, the divine truth. And the light of that, you open yourself, let it fill you, breathe in air which is purified with sunlight and freshness. And so when you think of the whole game, and I want to end with this idea, the whole game finally boils down to things happening at a vital level, behind which there is a will which is in the mental level, behind which there are forces, positive, negative, both. And the battle of the forces on each of these levels finally settles in its most material form, even at the level of physical illnesses, viruses and bacteria. But equally within us, our mind or our spiritual light that we can open to, and the mind and life energy down to the physical cells of our body, are really a crystallization in matter of our state of consciousness. And so if we consciously invoke the spiritual light, fill ourselves with the positive vibration and energy and lead it all the way down into the most material part of our body, well, that's the way to become increasingly more immune to these things. And that is the very nature of the yoga, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
So the yoga, in its truest sense and in its most physical result, is the means to become immune to these illnesses, and also for humanity to grow out of the root cause of these illnesses. Namaste.
Now, Professor, thank you for joining me today. Now, since the last time you and I spoke, there have been some major developments and bombshell studies that have just recently been published. Can you please tell our viewers what is the latest and the significance behind this?
There is now a transcript out there you can find by Googling my name. Let me briefly go through that interview. I review 4 different scientific studies in the literature, professional literature. First, a DNA genetic sequencing of the Wuhan coronavirus by scientists in France and Canada, and their conclusion is that it has gain-of-function properties. As we've discussed before, gain-of-function properties is only useful for offensive biological warfare work, and it has to be done in either a BSL-4 or a BSL-3 facility. And we know that Wuhan is a BSL-4 facility, And it said quite clearly when it was opening up, it was there to deal with coronaviruses and SARS. SARS is a weaponized version of the coronavirus. Wuhan has worked on that before. There have been already reported 2 or 3 leaks from there, so I suspect that's what happened here. Second, then, and you can find all these scientific articles on the interview, is a scientific article reported by the scientist at the University of North Carolina. It is clear that if you just read through it, that they were engaged in gain-of-function DNA genetic engineering on the SARS coronavirus. Likewise, if you read the study, one of the researchers there was one of the top biological warfare experts from China, and he, or that expert, I can't tell if it's a he or a she, but the name is there, was from the Wuhan BSL-4 facility. That's right on the scientific article itself. So it is clear that part of the technology here involved in this coronavirus came from that University of North Carolina lab. The last time I looked, it was BSL-3. The third article I discussed, again, scientific article, someone from that Wuhan facility also worked with scientists in Australia to DNA genetically engineer SARS together with HIV, which we've discussed before. And you have that Indian study with the pictures and everything saying that the current coronavirus involves HIV and SARS. Now, it appears political pressure was brought to bear on those Indian scientists. You know, Prime Minister Modi there is trying to have good relations with China and President Xi. But I read that study. I saw the pictures. It's undeniable. So I think what happened here then. Oh, and by the way, that too, if you read this study, clearly a scientist from Wuhan was involved with the Australian scientists, and the Chinese government paid for it. So this is not a case of China stealing this technology. They bought and paid for it. They bought their way into it. So I think, Spiros, what happened then is that the people there at Wuhan took the technology from North Carolina and the technology from this Australian study and tried to DNA genetically engineer it together to create a chimera of 3 elements at least. The SARS coronavirus, the gain of function technology from the University of North Carolina, and then the SARS HIV technology from Australia to create a sort of a turbocharged biological warfare agent. We saw this with the swine flu. Swine flu clearly had 3 elements that were DNA genetically engineered together in a biological warfare lab. So I believe that is what has happened here. And indeed now, the final study I discussed, 2 scientists from China itself, and you can see the study there, concluded that this probably leaked out of that Wuhan coronavirus. So you can read those 4 studies, for yourself and draw your own conclusions. They're all there annexed to my the transcript. But certainly that was my conclusion. You'll also note that the North Carolina contract was funded by the National Institutes for Health and NIAID, the National Institute for Allergy and Infected Diseases. So they're up to their eyeballs in this. They knew exactly what they were funding, and they were funding it with Wuhan. And that is why then we are getting total disinformation, lies, and propaganda by Fauci, by the National Institutes of Health, by NIA, this woman Les Monnier, if that's how you pronounce her name, and the CDC. I've also discussed with you why the WHO is lying about it and covering it up. So that, I think, is the importance of the interview I'm giving to you here today, to try to, cut through all this. If we're seeing all this mass confusion and pandemonium, it is because the highest level officials, certainly the United States government, the British government, the Japanese government, and others, will refuse to admit that this is an offensive biological warfare agent, because they're all doing the exact same thing. The United States, Britain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, I suspect Japan, Israel. So how can this properly be dealt with if the highest level officials of these governments are lying and covering up what is really going on here, let alone China, that's been lying, from the get-go. So that is my conclusion, Spiro, that it leaked out of this lab. They were working on this turbocharged biological warfare agent for offensive uses. Some lab worker got infected. This routinely happens at BSL-3, BSL-4 labs. Did not realize the infection, went out, did his or her normal daily activities there in Wuhan for maybe 24 days, 14 days. It turns out right now the reported that's not adequate quarantine. 24 days is now the estimate. That comes from Yale. And at the end of 24 days, came down with a fever, reported to a hospital there. No one really figured out what was going on here for a while. And by then it was just too late.
So, Professor Boyle, that is amazing information, and thank you for laying that out so clearly. Now, the 4 studies that you reference of the Wuhan coronavirus states clearly that this COVID-19 virus is without a doubt weaponized and altered 100% for sure. Is that what your analysis is of this, Professor?
Yes, just read the North Carolina study and the scientists there from the Wuhan facility. And also just read the Australian study and the scientists there from the Wuhan facility. This is, direct connection right there. And then these French scientists and the Canadian said, yes, it clearly has gain of function properties. And as I said before, that's the telltale sign of a biological warfare agent, which is exactly what we know University of North Carolina was working on. They even admit it. They admit how dangerous it was. They admit they got approval from NIH to do it, and then they got more approval from NIH to continue to do it.
So now, Professor Boyle, now that we have this evidence and proof, the smoking gun, as you put it, multiple smoking guns, that the Wuhan coronavirus is in fact a bioweapon, does this mean that there would already be a vaccine potentially, since the virus has been modified or engineered? Wouldn't they have reverse engineered the virus? And if so, why are we not seeing or hearing about this potentially available antidote or vaccine?
Well, Spiros, I don't really know if there is an effective vaccine. What happens here, all these BSL-3, BSL-4 facilities, what they do is, and we have 12 BSL-4 facilities here in the United States and maybe close to 200 BSL-3s. They go out and scour the world for the most dangerous pathogens they can find in order to weaponize them. Then they bring them back to these facilities and weaponize them with DNA genetic engineering, gain of function, synthetic biology, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Pentagon, etc. After they've then weaponized these, then they say, oh, well, we're really trying to make vaccines for the agents we've weaponized. But fine. So then they make the vaccines that may or may not work. That West African Ebola pandemic, I've already pointed out, that was produced by a so-called vaccine coming out of that Kenema BSL-4 lab run by the United States that injected those black Africans with live Ebola, and it set it all off. But even if they have an effective vaccine, which I sincerely doubt, those are the two components of a biological weapon itself. So it doesn't get them off the hook, because the two elements of a biological weapon are, one, the offensive agent to begin with, and then two, a vaccine so you can protect your own people. So they might have worked on a vaccine there. I don't know. They reverse engineer the biowarfare agent they have and then claim it's successful. But that didn't help over there in the West African Ebola pandemic at all. It was giving them live Ebola, and it set off that pandemic. So don't be deceived by this propaganda on this gain of function work or any of this other BSL-3, BSL-4s, all of which should be shut down immediately, that they're out there trying to develop vaccines. They're out there to develop weapons. They first DNA genetically engineer the offensive biological agent itself, and then they try to reverse engineer it to produce a vaccine. So that's really what's going on.
And Professor Francis Boyle, you have been in documentaries, you've written several books, authored the Biowarfare Act. You definitely know what you're talking about. And you did blow the whistle on that anthrax attack on Congress back in 2001. And since then, you've been blackballed by the mainstream media.
That is correct, Spiros. No one ever interviewed me again in any mainstream news media source here in the United States, Europe, BBC, Latin America, you name it, on biological warfare programs and weapons, including Ebola, Zika, and other events since then. That's correct. So this isn't an accident or something. Someone gave an order that I was to be blackballed and blacklisted. That's the way it works, Spiro. So fine. That's why I'm talking to you.
And I do appreciate you taking the time to do so. And essentially, just to recap, in a nutshell, these 4 studies that just came out recently of the Wuhan coronavirus have been weaponized. These studies show that definitively by the Chinese with the help of the United States and funded by the National Institutes of Health. This is unbelievable. And Professor Boyle, any closing thoughts or?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me, because we've been doing this for quite some time. That's why I drafted the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Act. It was to deal with these Nazi death scientists here in the United States doing this Nazi biological warfare weapons work that I condemned for the Council for Responsible Genetics in 1985.
And for those that don't know, the U.S. has an extensive history of testing biologicals on unknowing citizens here in the U.S. as well, dating back into the 50s, which is a topic for another day, I presume.
That's correct, too. Right. And if you're interested, the early history of the U.S. biological warfare, offensive biological warfare program is by Seymour Martin Hirsch, the Pulitzer Prize winner. And he takes the story up to when Nixon signs the, pretty much, it came out about 1968, and it's all in there, everything. I keep it here for reference purposes. So Nixon signed the Biological Weapons Convention, but what happened, as far as I can figure out, is that the Pentagon and the CIA took it underground, and they never really gave it up. And finally, it did emerge into the public record, starting with Reagan when I first tried to grapple with this problem and stop it. But as I said, if the US government has been financing all this Nazi biological warfare work, then of course they're not going to prosecute it.
Professor Francis Boyle, thanks again so much. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Spiro. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
If in our consciousness we are able to grow in positivity, goodwill, and positive will for resilience and good health, and if this intention or this quality of energy vibration can condense down to our most physical level, we can not only become reasonably, let's say, immune to these illnesses, but the goodwill we spread can also reduce and eventually neutralize the forms of ill will that these viruses or bacteria represent. And so you see, in its ultimate sense, it's a battle between the divine forces of evolution and the asuric forces. It operates on so many levels, but this is that grade of the vital physical domain of cellular and even viral structures, which is really a focal point for that battle finally. And so when you think of the whole game, and I want to end with this idea, the whole game finally boils down to things happening at a vital level, behind which there is a will which is in the mental level, behind which there are forces, positive, negative, both. And the battle of the forces on each of these levels finally settles in its most material form, even at the level of physical illnesses, viruses and bacteria. But equally within us, our mind or our spiritual light that we can open to, and the mind and life energy down to the physical cells of our body, are really a crystallization in matter of our state of consciousness. And so if we consciously invoke the spiritual light, fill ourselves with the positive vibration and energy, and lead it all the way down into the most material part of our body, well, that's the way to become increasingly more immune to these things. And that is the very nature of the yoga, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes.
So the yoga, in its truest sense and in its most physical result, is the means to become immune to these illnesses, and also for humanity to grow out of the root cause of these illnesses. Namaste.
You can see many of these on the website integralstudies.in on YouTube, and also Mother and Sri Aurobindo will have all of these as well.
Namaste.